impact of payments, modernization, and open banking on financial inclusion. I'm Kelly Sullivan from the PayTechs of Canada, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. There's a slide up here with some information for you. We do have prepared questions, but we'd also love to hear from you. So if you'd like to ask anything of our speakers, please use the Ask the Speaker function to ask a question, and we'll get to as many as we can throughout the session. You can also use the chat function to text and speak with each other. And just note that during the session, your mic and video will be disabled. So those are the only ways to communicate. I'm really looking forward to our session today, in particular, given the great panelists that we have joining us, because we hear a lot about financial inclusion, about how to improve Canada's financial sector and the benefit of our work for end users. But in those conversations, it's usually fintechs and banks and government officials who are doing the talking. And end users have opinions too. And today we're going to hear from them. We have 4 organizations who represent a broad range of consumers. They're going to tell us their stories, each from a different perspective, about how end users experience financial services in Canada today and how they'd like to experience them tomorrow. Whether you're a product developer or a policymaker, this is a chance to hear perspectives that are underrepresented and incorporate them into your day-to-day work. Let's get started with some introductions. If you could tell us each a bit about your organization and your end user demographic you represent. Liz, can you kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. I'm Liz Mulholland. I'm the CEO of Prosper Canada, and we're a national charity that works, excuse me, to create economic opportunity for people with low incomes through program and policy innovation. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm Meryl, Afrika. I'm the current chair for the Canadian Association of Urban Financial Professionals, or CAUFP for short. We're a member-based resource organization that's been around for over 25 years, and our mission is really to advance the economic situation for Black communities and professionals on Bay Street. So we focus on creating Black talent pipelines, providing networking opportunities, and professional development opportunities. Outside of the work that I do with the Canadian Association for Urban Financial Professionals, I also work in the payments industry. So I've worked for a variety of financial institutions, and currently am part of the payments practice at PwC.
Yeah, hi, my name is Meseret Haileyesus. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment, which is the only non-profit organization addressing financial and economic abuse through system change, education, and economic empowerment. We advocate for the development of new approach to end financial and economic abuse in the financial institution by working with organizations, people who have lived experience. And our goal is to economically empower survivors of gender-based violence, to improve their financial knowledge and strengthen their financial behaviors in order to improve their financial safety and security. Thank you.
Thanks. And Millie, can you close us out?
I can. I'm Millie Acuna, one of the managers of the asset building programs at to building stronger communities, increasing opportunities for folks who are living on lower levels of income through financial empowerment programs and services.
Great, thanks everyone. And we obviously can't cover off every single demographic in one panel, but this is a good breadth of the consumer ecosystem. So we're here at a payments conference with a bunch of payment services professionals. So of course, we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about financial services. But unlike the structure of our organizations, the world is not siloed. And describing the experience of end users can't be confined solely to how they're treated by the bank teller. So can you tell us some of the factors outside of the world of financial services that affect your end users' demographics, access to them? Millie, can we start with you?
Absolutely. I'd really like to talk about location because it brings up a number of factors. Whether you're living in remote or rural communities or living in low-income urban locations, there is a lack of accessible financial or mainstream financial services, including affordable financial services. In regards to accessibility, with a very increasing digital world, the lack of internet, a reliable internet connection, even use of technology is a factor in terms of challenges for a lot of our remote and low income families. Given location is also in regards to the age demographics and folks who are living with a disability. So that could also be challenging if a lot of the mass financial institutions have left the area or are simply not available. Another factor would be literacy and language barriers. Ultimately, working with Indigenous and newcomer populations, even youth, on the front lines, it can be very daunting and intimidating. In fact, it may not even be relatable from where they're coming from. So, looking for information that is meeting the needs of the community there and specific needs of the community that can be available in a very friendly and affordable way.
Great, thanks, Millie. Liz, what would you like to add?
Great. I'll just pick up on where Millie left off. I think when we're talking about consumers who have low incomes, high proportion are people with disabilities. So people may have cognitive disabilities in addition to mobility or physical disabilities. Mental health challenges can make people extremely vulnerable um, with or without low income. And at the same time, in the lower income population, we see a more generalized level of fear and mistrust of mainstream institutions, whether it's government, banks, and sometimes this stems from the fact that they may have experienced discriminatory or stigmatizing treatment by frontline financial services personnel when they try to access banking services. And I would highlight that this contrasts starkly with the rather glorious red carpet treatment they get from high risk, high cost alternative financial service providers who really want their business and are targeting them. And um, so, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. People may also have outstanding debts, and they're worried that if they put money in a bank account, it may be garnished. And they don't know the process for establishing whether or not somebody has a lien against their account. And it also costs about $300 to find out. So that's another barrier for people. And if we're talking about Indigenous communities, there's some people feel that mainstream banks and financial institutions are tightly implicated in the whole history of colonization and its legacy, as well as its ongoing impacts today. And consequently, there's reluctance to use those services if they're even available in their community. If they're in a northern or remote community, the odds are there are no mainstream financial services apart from maybe a northern store. So those are just some other factors that come into play when we're talking about low-income consumers. Thank you.
Ezra, I saw you nodding along to a few things that Liz was saying. What are some of the factors that your organization recognizes in your demographic? Meseret? Go ahead. I think you're on mute. There we go.
Yes. Yeah. So for the victims and survivors of gender-based violence and family violence, as you know, usually perpetrators will try to coercively control all the economic aspects of their life, including finance and banking accounts. And also, recently we finished our first study in Ottawa. Even according to our study, we have seen that perpetrators, increasingly try to steal their victims' credit card, bank account, bank statement, welfare, even SERPs, during the pandemic. That's what we have seen. So in our financial institution, there is a huge gap identifying and responding this issue and helping and protect women. It's very critical. So we have seen there's a lot of gaps, and we also constantly listen and hear tirelessly from many women, in our community. So financial institutions, they should have a system and a policy and practice in place to identify and then protect those women. Usually abusers want to control every aspect of women life, which affect the women economy and finance. And of course, we have seen also they create a lot of debt. Last has also renewed their credit score, and financial institutions, they don't have any special program specifically for a women to have a payment arrangement or special support and program specifically for Black, Indigenous, and racialized community in our context. So family violence, as you know, is very hidden, specifically with immigrant and marginalized community. And finances, so it's a taboo. There is a lot of layered and complex issue behind there. So what we have seen is financial institution is not accessible for many people, specifically for women who have been impacted by family violence. And there is a huge trust issue. So sometimes women, they prefer to keep their money on their mattress than going to the bank. So this is a huge gap, what we have seen. Of course, we have programs, but that program also expand and address this issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now that we have an understanding in the broader context of what it's like for consumers to access financial services outside of there, what's it like for consumers when they're trying to access or interacting with financial services, whether it be the government or service providers? What are they doing well, and what are the areas of improvement so that consumers can see the benefits that they're supposed to be getting out of all of these changes to the financial sector? Meryl, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think, with the onset of many of the commitments that financial institutions have made in regards to George Floyd, we've seen a lot of proactivity and focus on creating teams that are dedicated to the Black community, right? We're seeing a lot more investment in social impact, in partnerships with organizations like CAUFP and many others when it comes to things like financial literacy, programs to support entrepreneurs. We're also seeing funds being dedicated towards programs. For example, RBC gave $100 million that they're going to be lending to the Black community over the course of 5 years. And we see TD and RBC creating these diverse business development teams so that there's a face in the community when entrepreneurs come in the bank looking for a loan. And I think a lot of this it's great to see because this has really been lacking in the past. It's great to see them being that proactive. What I would like to see going forward is to ensure that not only do they have these frontline staff that's getting people in the door, getting them more engaged, but are they looking at the data? So when people are coming in, they're applying for a personal loan, a mortgage, and so forth. Are they going to be reviewing the data year over year to say, okay, we've got these applications, but why are they being denied? Is there something wrong with the criteria that we're judging these applicants under? Do we need to rethink that? Also looking at, are we educating the folks that are in the back office? They're not the ones in the front who are hearing the stories or who may have the same lived experience to understand that what might seem as a niche product may actually be something that's, a moneymaker for that community. But is there unconscious bias training in the same ways that they did that when looking at rethinking the way that they lend to female entrepreneurs? So I think for me, that's where I'm hoping that they will focus on to ensure that all of the investment that they've made right now continues to be successful. And has a much bigger impact over the long term.
Great, thanks. Millie, anything to add?
Yeah. So what's been really wonderful to see here on the front lines is a cross-sectoral collaboration among different levels of government and bigger systems. So there is an interest where we as community organizations are seeking help with big systems with identification or the different federal benefits, or looking for support in navigating the different provincial benefits. How do we access, how do we communicate, how do we answer the questions at that moment where they're looking for support? In Manitoba, we've established the Manitoba Financial Empowerment Network, which shows the ongoing conversations and the collaboratives that speak to a lot of policy change and what's happening in the current community, like what's happening right now. And then what's really neat is both myself and Liz were sitting in the Consumer Protection Advisory Committee through the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. And I'm feeling that there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes and consultation with folks like us, working at financial, the national financial literacy ecosystem or strategy that they're trying to identify, take a deeper dive. And so that is great movement towards the right direction. The challenge is that it does take a lot of time. with working with and hearing from the right folks, getting together and making that change. And so a lot of it is with us nonprofit organizations where we have that information, we've got the tools, and then how do we actually do that bigger picture? How do we make those changes effective for all? That is what I would say are positives and negatives.
No small challenge, eh, Millie? Meseret, over to you.
So just to actually, reiterate what my panelists, mentioned, specifically the presence of like very inclusive financial literacy strategy. We are also part of that roundtable. That may be a good opportunity specifically for frontline workers and grassroots advocates. That's a huge, movement and step. And the other thing is, in order to address financial and economic abuse, we already have, an infrastructure for elderly financial abuse in all Canadian banks and financial institutions. So I think that's a good, opportunity to expand and also to replicate that experience for people who's impacted by gender-based violence. Um, and the other things, also the presence of like, attention on financial equity this time during the pandemic. That's also another opportunity. We have seen that, yeah, a lot of banks, they have a lot of promises and in terms of funding and research, and that's also another thing. But what we need is we need to design specifically in order to address, gender-based violence in the financial, institution. Definitely, it has to be from trauma informed, and it has to also in line with, people perspective. So that's what we know we are advocating. I hope those opportunity will take us to the next level. That's my hope. But again, information has to be also from people who have lived experience perspective, because the social service is a little bit like, different the context. I know the business sector is a little bit, they have their own, perspective, but like, intersectoral collaboration, working with like, social service organization, like maybe mental health, gender-based violence, credit collectors. I think those contexts would be very useful because we have seen best experience in United Kingdom, in Australia. They are right now working agencies, they work closely with a financial institution. And we have seen that when women, they leave that abusive relationship easily and build their wealth after they leave that situation. I think creating that ecosystem would be the next step. Of course, we have a beautiful strategy out there. Thank you.
And Liz?
Thanks, Kelly. I think I can pull on some of the threads that my fellow panelists have already raised, but the new financial consumer protection framework federally that governs banking services, I think, is a great opportunity. It's really inviting banks to take a real look at how to ensure the products and services they provide are appropriate and accessible when it comes to vulnerable consumers. And some banks and particularly fintechs are even looking at how they can go further than that. So beyond that kind of do no harm standard to looking at how they can actively build consumer financial health, which is amazing. So, and we would love to see more of that because at the end of the day, if you're going to invest all that money to get a customer, delivering real value for them is how to keep that customer. And I think we can do a better job, and what gets inspected gets respected. So if we're tracking how our consumers are doing and whether we're building their financial health, we're going to see real gains. I think the key to meeting those needs of vulnerable consumers, though, and ensuring your products and services are appropriate, and this goes for government as well as banking institutions, is really having a detailed understanding of the context and needs and challenges of vulnerable clients. And there are different groups. There are different causes of vulnerability. It may be low income. It may be domestic violence. It may be racialization. There's all sorts of different ways to slice this. But at the end of the day, if you don't understand that context and their needs and the challenges, then and you're not designing for that, you're not going to be appropriate and accessible to those consumers. So, and there are best practices. I mean, other jurisdictions have been developing them, their guidelines, et cetera. The UK has done a great job on serving vulnerable financial consumers. So let's look around and take the best and do a little made in Canada as well. But I think to get there, banking services and governments need to be clear on their goals. Are they doing the do no harm, or are they really going to aim higher? And secondly, I think they need to get used to the idea that they're going to have to look outside their own organizations for the expertise, as Meseret has said, It resides outside of banks and it resides outside of government. You need to work with intermediary organizations that have deep roots in these different communities, that understand, that have immediate connection to end users, and can facilitate that kind of service design, user-centered design, discovery, research, et cetera, that's really going to create really effective services and products that really work for people. So I think if we can get better at working at that level together across these different kind of sectoral silos, I think there are huge opportunities to really move the dial for vulnerable consumers, and we can make real progress. I would say what's not working right now is there's an absolute gap in the market when it comes to affordable, quality, personal financial help and advice for low and modest income Canadians. Research shows categorically everybody does better financially when they get good quality financial help and advice. But right now, if you can't afford to pay professionals for it, you don't get it, except for a few organizations like Millie's that are out there delivering fantastic support. So really, when markets fail, it's time to ask governments and community to step in. The good news is for the past 7 years, we've been piloting and experimenting with different financial help interventions and ways of delivering services to vulnerable communities in Canada. And we've made enormous headway, and the evidence is in, and this stuff works. So we have models, we have players on the ground. The question now, and we've even got city governments and provincial governments that are saying, hey, we should be building this into our public services because this is going to make a real difference to the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and it's going to help people become more financially stable and secure. The missing piece, though, is sustained national investment in some community financial help infrastructure across the country. And when we look around the world, the UK, Australia, New Zealand have all taken this step. They have national investment. They've set this as part of their economic recovery strategies for COVID. And I think it's time that Canada does the same. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. So what I'm hearing across all of you is collaboration is key between banks, governments, fintechs, and organizations like yours. And clearly the end experiences of end users are quite varied, but there are some similarities and overlap. And at PayTechs of Canada, we recently conducted some research on this topic. And one of the stats noted that one population that feels more stress when interacting with the financial services sector is women. And the stat even resonated with me because even though I work in financial services, when I'm the customer, I feel stressed. But my experience is much different than a Black woman who's an entrepreneur interacting with a VC firm or a woman in crisis leaving an abusive situation. So Meseret, Meryl, can you tell us about how the women you work with may experience that stress?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So I think, one of the biggest complaints for a lot of Black female founders is that they don't feel that their financial institution really sees or values the business that they're bringing to them, right? So they'll come in, they'll pitch their idea, and sometimes the business advisor won't really understand sort of the niche market that they're in. And I think a perfect example of that is, for example, entrepreneur and Cityline TV contributor Vivian Kay, who runs a 7-figure business in the hair weave industry. She pitched her bank to get funding. She was an experienced entrepreneur. This was a second venture, and she couldn't get funding behind her. She had a great plan, great credit, all the good things that you should have, but the financial institution just didn't understand the business model. Not knowing that this is an industry that she's in that by 2028 is targeted to be a $3.4 billion market for North America. We've just recently seen venture capital pour $300 million behind an entity that's actually working in the same industry. And so that is an example of somebody who, their financial institution missed an opportunity with them. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of female entrepreneurs. Similarly, studies have shown that, the venture capital industry, less than 1% of all the funding actually goes to Black female founders. So when somebody's starting a business, immediately they're thinking, I'm not going to get money, not out of my bank, not at venture capital. So there's sort of this choice to elect out of the financial ecosystem. So they choose to end up self-funding. And maybe by the time they go to the financial institution, they may not necessarily be presenting the best picture because they're financially stressed. And so I think what we need to see is better ways that financial institutions, VCs, can get behind some of these entrepreneurs. We see fintechs like ClearCo pop up, who's doing an alternative form of capital raising and providing that. But if you're not in the e-commerce ecosystem, that's not an option for you. So I think finding, and I think this may come from the bank's now engagement with the Black community, to communicate with Black female founders on ways that they can sort of pitch their business, maybe understanding whether or not their credit models actually work. Do they need to rethink the way that they're looking at certain niche markets that may not be prevalent in Canada, but actually are a big market down in the US, and seeing is there ways that they can get these entrepreneurs to actually opt into the financial system rather than just choosing to sort of rely on themselves and crowdsourcing in order to fund their business model.
Meryl, Meseret?
Yeah, so from our current study, as I mentioned, we did the first economic abuse study up in the national capital region. So, of course, from our study participants, 47% of participants felt their access to service was improved during COVID-19. So in our research, we try to check like how financial also institutions are able to help victims and survivors of gender-based violence. So our study actually showed that financial institution was the least helpful for women who's impacted by gender-based violence. And also we have seen that many women, they were struggling even to access their own banking. We have seen also many women, their electronic signature was stolen by perpetuators. And also there's a lot of incident what happened during this pandemic. But we have seen other services like the criminal, the legal system, the medical service, counseling, shelters was improved as due to the pandemic. So this is again just a huge gap. And plus, we also advocated this issue for the Financial Consumer Agency Canada, and then we rate this issue at many platforms. But what we suggest in order to improve, specifically protect women, first we need to develop like a trauma-informed policies and practice in our financial institution. We need to educate like a frontline workers. There's also huge stigma associated with family violence, and also we encourage financial institution to create economic abuse, fraud alert in their account. For example, when the women flee to the shelters, the bank has to be the first line of defense. That's what even we heard. So that's also system has to be in place. And also we encourage and also advocate to assign a designated internal team member that can handle survivors, account, specifically when there is a joint account and a joint, like any financial product, still perpetuator, he can access in any way. So women are unsafe. And of course, keeping also survivors' information confidential, it's also a huge gap. That's what we have seen. As you know, women, they leave their situation, stay in transition housing because of their safety. So identity is also very important thing, and that's what we have seen in many women they face. We also actually advocate right now to have like a special financial product for women, like maybe just affordable saving and checking account. That's also another thing the financial institution they can help. We have seen also many countries have special even program like a payment arrangement on dates, specifically if they have a coercive date or if there is any family violence. And also in addition to that, that also of course is helps for her women to secure even affordable housing. As you know, we encourage women to live abusive relationship, but of course housing is a problem. But also you have to have like certain requirements to qualify even to get housing, right? You should have a good credit card, you should have a bank account, you should have employment. So this again layer for a woman not to live that abusive situation. So if our bank and financial institution have a program specifically like training their frontline workers on how to flag and respond, plus protecting their identity, if they could have also some affordable product. For example, if I stay in shelter, if my friends or family members in US, if they want to send us money, there's also transaction fee. So even $10 for a woman, they can buy milk for their kids. When you are in transition housing, $10 it matters for many women. So that's why we want to kind of enable banks, if they could introduce this kind of inclusive and sustainable program for a women, they can start their own business, they can build their, own economy. So I think this is a huge gap. Hopefully the Canadian bank also, they will do this kind of initiative, because we have seen Australia, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and US, they have amazing program for women who's impacted by this situation. So, yeah, that's what I would like to, put from the gender-based violence perspective.
Thank you. And what two really great examples that are totally different, and a perfect example of why a stat is only as useful as its first glance, and the importance of looking and asking more questions. We have a question in the chat about seniors, and I'm thinking maybe Liz or Millie could answer this one. I've not heard much about seniors in this session. What needs to be done to ensure that seniors are better able to access new programs and options?
Liz, I feel like you're most passionate about this.
Well, I can take a stab, and then what did I miss? You can leap in, Millie.
Sounds good.
Wow. So seniors are living on fixed incomes often, so affordability is always going to be a question. And I know the banks have accounts for seniors that are low cost. So that's great. I think we can do more on the financial abuse of seniors, because I don't think that's a robust enough framework that we have now. It relies on the senior actually complaining. And often when people are victims of financial abuse, they're the last person to acknowledge that it's going on. So there have to be more checks and balances, I think, in that way. In terms of accessibility, I think, the interface with technology is something that there's a wide spectrum of capability among seniors. Some take to it like a duck to water. Others, there may be a cost issue with accessing the internet, a geographic lack of infrastructure issue with accessing the internet, or just a digital skills gap. So I think the whole question of the digital divide in Canada is one that needs to move up the priority scale, with particular attention to vulnerable groups and their access. And I would include seniors amongst them. Not all seniors are vulnerable, but many will struggle or be left behind if we're constantly seeing everybody moving to do everything online. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, but we're leaving people behind whenever we do that. And we saw that when many government offices closed their doors, and even community ones during the pandemic. And people were told, well, go online to access services or get the information you need to navigate all these challenges that suddenly were in people's lives. And a lot of seniors had a terrible time, and we're very isolated. So I think we need to be thinking on two tracks. And over time, there'll be fewer and fewer seniors who have a digital divide. But for now, it's an issue. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
I would just want to jump in and echo what Liz mentioned. Ultimately, what House Seed responded when the pandemic first hit, it was how do we communicate with folks who have limited access to technology? And it was creating a helpline. And I've actually seen an increase in our seniors reaching out through the helpline to speak to someone, just speak and get some connection, and ultimately sending documents or forms by snail mail, using the mail to send us information. And so walking them through, having that time, ensuring that there are people to support when they call in is critical. And so at that point, it's just ensuring that there are supports in place where it is just in time for them, particularly with the GIS federal benefits that were impacted with the elders and seniors with CERB, or national emergency response benefits during COVID. Unfortunately, there were a lot of folks who misunderstood that benefit, or perhaps were maybe pressured to obtain this income to survive the pandemic. But then afterwards, it's like, where do we go now? Where do we understand how this impacts me and long term? Not that their pension and their benefits have been impacted. Where do we turn to? So it is getting the right information and ensuring that they're getting proper supports in place at the right time is super critical. And unfortunately, what I've seen is people taking advantage of our elders and seniors when they're most vulnerable. So there is that responsibility of frontline staff and financial institutions to see the signs and to ensure, take a moment and ask, how are you doing? How can we help you? add that extra value in service.
Right. Thanks, Millie, for that. There's another question in the chat. We're running a bit low on time, so I'm just going to ask this one. Do you have any suggestions for policymakers on how to better engage these groups and organizations on the topic when developing policy, conducting research, both formally and ad hoc? Anyone want to take that one? All of you touched on the importance of collaboration. And so I think this anonymous question asker is looking for a bit of how. Liz, I see your hand up.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time on this one. This goes kind of to the heart of the whole open data and open government question. We've had excellent research collaborations with private sector partners, including TD Bank, who launched a national study for us, other financial sector partners who've used their regular polls to add questions for us, et cetera, or funded research. When it comes to some government research, though, often it takes so long to get it approved to release it. And it would be of so much value in terms of identifying who needs help and getting to them and targeting services to the right places that it just never happens. But there's also sometimes reluctance to engage in collaborative research. So there's lots of kind of come to a meeting and tell us what you're doing. But then when it actually comes to collaborating, to doing the research together and mobilizing our each sector's kind of skills, expertise, and networks, et cetera, it often breaks down. So it goes back to the point that I think we really need to see large government institutions saying we need to get better at partnering, identifying the right strategic partners to close these gaps. We call it the last mile gap in financial help services. How do we make sure that these people who are pushed to the margins of society at one point or another in their lives, how do we make sure we're reaching them? Governments are not going to reach them on their own. They're only going to reach them through intermediaries who have a trusted relationship with those people. So, and they vary. So I think governments need to figure out this problem of how we work together. And that includes doing the research together. So we're building a shared understanding and bringing financial institutions into this picture as well. Although who seem to be a little more nimble. I know nimble and bank don't usually go together, but they seem to be more interested, I think, sometimes, or a little more able to mobilize around research questions that they see as pertinent to their consumer base. So I think it's something that we have to work on. But the first thing is government needs to acknowledge we cannot get there on our own. We need to collaborate. We need to put the structures and the right funding relationships in place to do this.
Yeah, I just want to add to Elizabeth's point. I think, and not speak specifically for the Black population, we've seen a lot of, like I said, a lot of programming being put out by the financial institutions, but we've also seen the Canadian federal government put out like the entrepreneurship fund, right? And we've had BDC that's opened up a large VC focused on supporting Black entrepreneurs. And I think it'll be great to see policymakers form those partnerships to one self-assess on the government level, like what are we as a government doing right or doing wrong in this program that we've rolled out, and then working with the financial institutions to collect data, whether it's anonymously or in whatever way, to assess these programs that and things that they're putting out, and use this as an opportunity for government as well as the financial institutions to be able to go forward and shape the way that we just position the products on the market, the way we think about inclusive banking, the way we think about how do we get folks that are out of the ecosystem, getting them back in, whether that's through gaining better trust, better support. Maybe it's not even moving as fast digitally because folks are clearly being left behind. Like rethinking the way that we support everyone so we can collectively move forward as an industry.
Yeah,
Thanks, Meryl.
and
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're very, very low on time. And I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to close out. So Meseret, maybe you could wrap your comments into your closing remarks. Because we opened up this conversation today noting that when consumers are brought into these conversations, they're usually being talked about and not on behalf of. So when you hear others speaking about your end user demographic, what frustrates you the most? What do they get wrong or overlook? And as we close out, what do you want our audience to take away about your end user demographics and their experience with financial service? And we're very low on time. So I'll just ask you to limit your responses to 1 minute so we get a chance for everyone to close out. So Millie, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, it's when we're talking about the digital world and divide, it's ultimately the end user experience. Are we doing what's best for them as a consumer? Are we thinking for their benefit? I know that a lot of our digital world is about convenience and security, but at the end of the day, will this particular service help them become more financially healthy? I'm hearing a lot of the open banking for convenience and transporting information, but I teach a lot of my participants about securing their information and being aware of how that information is being used, and that they have the right to say yes or no in terms of what information can be shared. So the most important piece to all of this when it comes to digital payments and so forth is, yes, convenience, security is very important, but can we ensure that the consumer is remembered like at the top of the list here in terms of how this will impact them financially and their well-being, and ensuring that they're still empowered to make these decisions on their own?
Great. Thanks, Millie. Meryl?
Yeah, what I would say is, I would like to see them continue post their 5-year plan, all this investment that they've made in the Black community in terms of business development and lending products and that sort of thing. What I also would say is to the folks that are focused on developing products, to remember that we have to think about, in the Black demographic, a lot of the folks that come to this country are coming from continents and countries that are far more further ahead than Canada digitally. So when we're thinking about how we're positioning the Black consumer experience, we have to keep that in mind, is that not every Black customer is going to be the same as the traditional customer that we're seeing today.
Great. Thanks. Meseret?
So I would like to say that financial and economic abuse, actually, from family violence perspective, it's also a business issue, because protecting women and educating women and helping women, it really also, benefit the financial institution one or another way. So this issue has to be addressed. That's what I would like to share, this message, because it's very critical. And also, in terms of the federal government, of course, it's already mentioned, but data is very important. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data that shows how many even women impacted, and also how financial institution even help. So financial institution, I know they have a lot of research out there as well, making sure this kind of issue is including in their research. It really addresses those socioeconomic problem in one or another way. And the other thing is, what I would like to say as well is, we need to work collaboratively, because it's a social justice issue. It affects everyone, whether family members or legal system, you name it. So working together is very important, and bringing this issue as a business issue, it just like create a system change, and also it creates a societal economic well-being. And of course, one last thing, I know there's a lot of funding out there, but like when we mention about women are, we are diverse, right? So we need to also understand our context, specifically those people who come to this new country. They have highly impacted with family violence. 99% of them also impacted by financial abuse. So again, that's also another loop. So when you have a newcomers, just make sure that if you have any program, include family violence in your conversation, in your policy. So that's my takeaway, and thank you so much.
Great. And Liz, you started us off and you get to close us out.
Okay, well, I'd like to broaden out a little bit to just emphasize the fact that I think the pandemic has really shone a pretty stark light on growing social and economic divides in Canada. And the people that we see on the wrong side of the divide are people with low incomes, racialized communities, youth, and recent newcomers, and women, particularly in all those groups. So the question now in front of all of us is, what are we going to do about this? And what kind of recovery are we going to have? And I think every sector needs to be thinking about this actively, and how we can shrink those gaps, because a society where they get broader is not one that any of us want to live in. It's not good for anybody. And when we help everybody to prosper, we all do better. I think for financial services, that means looking at your philanthropy, but it also means going beyond looking at just your philanthropy to think about how you're providing products and services, and whether there are ways that you can make them more inclusive of these groups, and better building their financial health so that they have access to more economic opportunity. I think the good news is that there are many insights, opportunities, and solutions that we can draw on, and there are more every day. And there are a ton of organizations that are interested, and I think you have a great selection here today, but there are many more who are interested in working with financial sector service providers to help them do just that. So call us and let's get to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. What a perfect way to end that session. And that closes out our time for today. For our panelists, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your expertise with us. It was a great conversation, and I'm sure our audience took away as much as I did. And for everyone in the audience, thank you for your questions and your attendance at today's panel. Enjoy the rest of your day at the summit.